Eleanor Whitmore pressed both palms flat against the locked door and screamed until her throat gave out and not a single soul in that grand Massachusetts estate moved to open it. 3 years. 3 years she had been breathing inside these walls while her stepmother stood in Boston parlors and told people Eleanor was dead. She wasn't dead. She was worse than dead. She was invisible. If this story breaks your heart the way it broke mine, subscribe to this channel, drop your city in the comments, and don't you dare leave before the ending. The summer of 1815 came to the Whitmore estate the way it always did, heavy gold-soaked and indifferent to the misery happening inside its walls. The roses along the east garden bloomed without permission. The bees moved slow and drunk through the heat. And somewhere beyond the locked door of the upper east wing, Eleanor Whitmore turned 22 years old, without a single candle, without a single voice saying her name. She had stopped counting the days sometime in the second year. Counting made it worse. Counting meant she expected something to change, and nothing ever changed inside this house, not since the morning her stepmother had looked her dead in the eye across the breakfast table and said with the calm of a woman ordering linen, "From this day forward you do not exist." Eleanor had laughed. She'd actually laughed because she'd thought Margaret was being dramatic. She wasn't laughing anymore. She heard them before she saw anything. Voices in the front hall, low and formal. The kind of voices men used when they wanted other men to know they carried authority without having to announce it. Eleanor pressed herself against the interior wall of her room and listened. The housemaid, Vera, old Vera, who left food trays outside Eleanor's door twice a day without ever meeting her eyes, was speaking in that quick, breathless way she got when someone made her nervous. "The mistress wasn't expecting callers today, sir. If you'd care to leave your card?" "I don't leave cards, ma'am." The man's voice was even. Not unkind, but not movable either. "I leave court orders. Is Mrs. Whitmore in residence or is she not?" A silence stretched out in the hall below. Eleanor's hand found the edge of the windowsill. "Who was that?" "She is." "She is at home, sir?" "Yes. If you'll wait in the parlor." "I'll wait right here. Thank you." Eleanor exhaled slowly. She pressed her ear harder against the wall, as though she could hear through wood and plaster and 3 years of silence. Margaret Whitmore descended the main staircase like a woman who had never once in her entire 40 years on this earth been caught off guard. Her dark silk morning dress whispered against each step. Her expression was composed into that particular arrangement Eleanor knew better than she knew her own face, polite, gracious, utterly impenetrable. "Judge Reed." Her voice carried that practiced warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure. Had I known you were riding out to Whitmore this morning, I'd have had cook prepare." "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Whitmore." Judge Nathaniel Reed did not take the hand she extended toward him. He looked at it for exactly 1 moment, then looked back at her face. "I'm here on a matter of the estate. Specifically, the Whitmore estate arbitration filing that was submitted to the federal court in Boston 6 weeks ago." Margaret's smile did not waver. "Of course. Though I must say I wasn't aware a federal judge personally oversaw such routine filings. I expected a clerk, perhaps. Most filings are routine." He reached into his coat and produced a document folded and sealed. "This one presented certain irregularities that required my personal attention." The word irregularities landed in the front hall like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor, 1 floor above, felt the ripple of it. She had never heard that word applied to her family's legal affairs. She pressed closer to the wall. Margaret accepted this document. She did not open it. "Irregularities," she repeated in the tone of someone repeating a word in a foreign language they found mildly distasteful. "I'm sure whatever confusion exists can be resolved quite simply. The Whitmore estate has been in full legal compliance since my late husband's passing. Our family solicitor, Mr. Henshaw, can speak to that at any..." Mr. Henshaw's office submitted the filing. Judge Reed's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Which is why the irregularities are of particular interest, because the filing references a living heir, Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of the late Edmund Whitmore. And yet, there is no record of any legal proceeding declaring that person deceased. No death certificate filed with the county. No record of emigration. No notice of incapacitation. He paused. There is, however, a substantial inheritance transfer dated 14 months ago that proceeds as though no such person exists. The silence in the hall was of a completely different quality now. Eleanor's breath stopped. She heard her own heartbeat. He knows her name. He said her name. Not like a rumor. Not like a ghost story. Like a legal fact. Eleanor. Margaret said the name like someone identifying a piece of furniture they'd had removed. My stepdaughter, yes. She passed away 2 years ago, Judge Reed. It was a private matter. The family chose not to make a public announcement out of grief. I see. He did not sound like he saw anything of the sort. And the burial records? She was interred on the estate grounds. A private ceremony. The estate grounds. He said it slowly. Ma'am, I'll need to see that burial site. And I'll need to speak with whatever physician attended the death. And I'll need the original will of Edmund Whitmore, not the modified copy your solicitor submitted to the court, but the original witness document. A pause, precise and deliberate. If it exists. Margaret's voice came out very carefully measured. Judge Reed, I must say I find this line of questioning deeply inappropriate, given my family's state of grief. Mrs. Whitmore. His voice cut through hers, not loudly but cleanly, the way a good blade goes through something. I've been a federal judge for 6 years. I know what grief looks like in a legal filing, and I know what fraud looks like. Another pause. I'm not yet saying which one this is, but I will be. Eleanor's legs were shaking. She hadn't realized she'd moved until she felt the floorboard under her shift slightly beneath her weight, and she caught herself against the wall, heart hammering, afraid the sound had carried. Fraud. He said the word fraud to Margaret's face. No one said that to Margaret's face. Not in this house. Not anywhere in Boston that Eleanor had ever heard of. People smiled at Margaret Whitmore. People accepted her dinner invitations and deferred to her opinions and pretended very hard not to notice the things that happened inside these walls. This man, this Judge Reed, had ridden out to the estate unannounced, refused her tea, declined to shake her hand, and said the word fraud within the first 4 minutes of conversation. Eleanor pressed her back flat against the wall and breathed as quietly as she could. And for the first time in 3 years, not hope, she was too careful for hope, but something adjacent to it moved through her chest like heat. She heard Margaret's voice again, recovered now, smooth as poured cream. I think, Judge Reed, that you've ridden a long way on a warm morning, and perhaps some refreshment. I'd like to tour the estate grounds. He said it pleasantly. If you don't object, I'd like to see the burial site you mentioned. A pause. Of course. I'll have Vera show you. I'd prefer you accompany me, Mrs. Whitmore, given that it concerns a member of your immediate family. Eleanor heard footsteps. Retreating ones. Margaret's heels on marble, moving toward the back of the house, buying herself time. Regrouping, Eleanor knew that walk. She knew exactly what Margaret's face looked like during that walk, the way the pleasantness dropped off it, the moment no one important was watching, the way her jaw went hard. She knew, because she'd watched it for years before she stopped being allowed to watch anything. The moment the hall went quiet, Eleanor moved. She did not have free run of the East Wing, Margaret had made certain of that, but she had, over 3 years of careful methodical observation, learned which floorboards to avoid, which servant moved, which direction, at which hour, and exactly how long Vera's midday route took when Vera thought she was alone. There was a gap, 12 minutes give or take, between when Vera left with the lunch tray and when she returned from the kitchen cellar. Eleanor had never used it for anything. She'd never had a reason. She had one now. She moved through the secondary corridor, keeping to the wall, stepping over the third board from the left at the junction near the linen closet, and reached the small upper landing that looked down over the east garden. The garden that opened to the side grounds, the grounds that bordered the stone pathway that led to the orchard, and beyond the orchard, there. He was walking the path alone. Margaret had not apparently joined him. She'd sent a groundsman instead, a young man named Thomas, who looked deeply uncomfortable, being in the company of a federal judge, and showed it by staring at his own boots. Judge Nathaniel Reed was not looking at the garden. He was looking at the east wing. He was looking at the windows. He was looking at her window. Eleanor did not step back in time. Their eyes met. She didn't know what she expected from him. Surprise, maybe. Or the polite pretense of not having seen her people were very good at that in her experience. Looking at something inconvenient and simply deciding not to acknowledge it. He didn't look away. He didn't reach for anything. No paper, no document. He just stood on that garden path in his dark coat and his road-dusty boots and looked up at her steadily, the way you look at something you intend to remember. Then he tipped his hat. One deliberate motion, unhurried. Eleanor's hand came up before she decided to move it, pressed flat against the glass. Not a wave, not a signal. She didn't know what it was. Her body had just responded to being acknowledged. As though some part of her had forgotten a person could be acknowledged, and the muscle memory fired anyway. She pulled her hand back. Thomas the groundsman said something. Judge Reed turned toward him, nodded, and followed him down the path without looking back. But he'd seen her. Eleanor stood at the window long after they were gone, long after the garden went quiet again, and the summer heat pressed back against the glass, and she turned that moment over in her mind, the way she'd turned everything over in this room, slowly, carefully trying to understand the shape of it. He was looking for a grave. He was looking for her grave. And he hadn't found one. Margaret came to the east wing that evening. Eleanor heard the key, always that specific sound, the bolt turning, which Margaret did herself, rather than trust any servant with it, and she was sitting at the small writing table when the door opened because she refused to be caught standing at the window again. Refused to let Margaret know that something had shifted. "We had a visitor today," Margaret said by way of greeting. She did not come fully into the room. She stood in the doorway, the way she always stood, taking up exactly the width of the frame, as though even the architecture served her purposes. "I assume you heard." Eleanor kept her hands folded on the table. "I heard voices. Judge Reed, from Boston." Margaret's voice was careful, in a way it only got when she was thinking several steps ahead. "He has concerns about the estate filing. It will be resolved." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I'll need you to remain in this wing for the next several days. We'll have guests coming and going, and I won't have any—" A pause, deliberate. "Complications." Eleanor looked at her. "You mean you won't have me seen?" "I mean," Margaret said with the patience of someone explaining something simple to someone they'd decided was slow, "that I won't have my family's private affairs complicated by gossip or confusion. You understand?" It was not a question. Eleanor said nothing. Margaret looked at her for a moment longer, that flat, assessing look that Eleanor had spent years trying to interpret, and had finally concluded simply meant you are a problem. "I have not yet finished solving," and then she pulled the door shut and turned the key. Eleanor listened to her footsteps go down the hall. Then she turned back to the window. The next morning she found a note. Not from a person, not passed hand to hand, not left by Vera with the tray. It was tucked under the door, a narrow fold of paper slid through the gap at the floor. Eleanor stared at it for a full minute before she picked it up. "Miss Whitmore, the law does not recognize informal arrangements. If you are alive, and I believe you are, then you have rights that no document signed by another party can legally extinguish. I am in residence at the Hartwell Inn in the village until Friday. I am not here to cause you distress. I am here because something in your father's estate does not add up, and I intend to understand what." N. Reed Federal Circuit Judge Eleanor read it 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time more slowly, as though the words might change. "If you are alive, and I believe you are." She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed that Margaret had never bothered to replace with anything better, and she pressed the note against her sternum, and she breathed. She had not cried in a very long time. She'd stopped when she realized crying made no difference. But something moved through her now that she didn't have a name for, not grief, not relief, not hope. Something older and more animal than any of those. Something that recognized on a level below language that it had just been told, I see you. I am looking directly at you, and I am not going away. She spent the rest of that day making a decision. It took her until almost midnight to make it, because she had not made a real decision in 3 years. Every choice she'd had reduced to nothing what she ate when she slept, whether Vera came or didn't come, whether Margaret was in a generous mood or otherwise. The muscle for deciding had gone soft with disuse, but she made it. By the time the house went quiet around her, Eleanor Whitmore had decided something that would have terrified her 6 months ago and felt tonight as inevitable as breathing. She was going to answer that note. She did not have paper. She did not have ink. But she had a piece of charcoal she'd saved from the fireplace weeks ago for reasons she hadn't consciously understood at the time. And she had the back of Vera's daily menu card that had been left on the tray that afternoon. And she had a window that, if opened quietly enough, could receive a folded slip of paper through its gap and drop it into the garden below if someone was careful enough, and patient enough, and willing enough. She had been in this room long enough to know how to be all three. She wrote 4 words, not her name, not a plea, not a description of what had happened to her. She didn't have enough paper for that, and she suspected he already knew. Just 4 words. The will was changed. She folded it twice, weighted it with the only thing she had, a small hairpin, and on the second night after he'd tipped his hat at her through the glass, Eleanor Whitmore opened her window 2 inches in the dark and let the paper fall into the roses below. And she sat back down on the edge of that bed, and she pressed her hands together between her knees to stop them shaking, and she thought, now we see. Now we see what kind of man tips his hat at a ghost. The note disappeared from the roses before dawn. Eleanor knew because she did not sleep. She sat on the edge of that narrow bed with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the pale gray light come up through the window glass, and at some point between the darkest hour and the first bird, she looked down into the garden, and the paper was gone. She did not know if he had taken it. She did not know if the wind had taken it, or a servant, or if Margaret, God help her, had somehow known to look. She sat with that uncertainty, the way she'd learned to sit with most things in this room, quietly, without flinching, because flinching used energy she could not afford to waste. She was still sitting there when Vera's footsteps came down the hall and stopped outside the door, and the tray scraped across the floor through the gap at the bottom. "Vera," Eleanor said. The footsteps paused. "Vera, I know you can hear me." A long quiet. Then very softly, as though speaking would cost her something, "Yes, miss." "The man who came yesterday, Judge Reed." Eleanor kept her voice low and even. "Where is he staying?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Miss, I can't." "You're not being asked to do anything," Eleanor said. "I'm not asking you to carry a message or speak to anyone or put yourself in harm's way. I'm asking where he said he was staying. You were in the hall when he arrived. I know you heard." The silence stretched out long enough that Eleanor thought Vera had walked away. Then the old woman's voice came back barely above a whisper, pressed close to the door gap, as though she were confessing in a church. "Hartwell Inn, in the village, he said until Friday." Eleanor closed her eyes. Friday. That was 3 days. "Thank you, Vera." The footsteps moved away fast, the way feet move when a person is ashamed of what they just did and needs distance from it. Eleanor picked up the tray. She ate every bite methodically, because she had learned in the first year that skipping meals made her slow, and she could not afford to be slow. Not now. Not with 3 days and a federal judge, and a note she'd already dropped into the roses, and no way of knowing whether any of it meant a single thing. She ate and she thought, and she made herself be very precise about what she actually knew versus what she hoped. What she knew, Nathaniel Reed was a federal judge. He had come to the estate unannounced. He had asked about irregularities in the estate filing. He had looked for a burial site and not found one. He had passed a note under her door. He had said, "If you are alive, and I believe you are," what she hoped. Everything else. She was very careful to keep those two categories separate. Teacher. 2 floors below, at that same early hour, Margaret Whitmore sat at the writing desk in her private study and composed a letter in her careful, angular hand. She wrote to Mr. Henshaw first. The letter to her solicitor was precise and without sentiment. The judge's visit has complicated the timeline. The institution transfer must be accelerated. I will need the guardianship documents completed and witnessed no later than Thursday. She read it back once, sealed it, and set it aside. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and looked at nothing in particular. She was not a woman who panicked. She had not panicked when Edmund died, not even when she'd realized the original will existed somewhere that she hadn't yet found. She had not panicked when Eleanor had screamed herself hoarse in the early months before she'd learned that screaming produced nothing. She did not intend to panic now simply because a federal judge had come riding out from Boston asking inconvenient questions. Judges were men. Men had ambitions. Men had pressure points. She had handled men before. What she needed to do was simple. She needed Eleanor gone before Friday. Gone in a way that closed every legal door Judge Reed was currently pushing against. If Eleanor was in the care of a certified medical institution, declared incompetent by a licensed physician, transferred under a valid guardianship order, then there was nothing a federal judge could do except review the documents, find them properly executed, and ride back to Boston. She pulled a second sheet of paper toward her. The letter to Dr. Graves was shorter. She didn't need to explain much to Dr. Graves. He'd been taking her money for 8 months. He understood his role. The matter we discussed requires immediate action. I will need the certification signed and the transport arranged for Thursday morning before dawn. Bring 2 men you trust. She will not come willingly. She sealed that one too, rang for her houseman to deliver both letters, and went to wake her daughter. Clara Whitmore was 18, and she had her father's eyes, that particular shade of gray that went darker in bad weather, lighter, when she was thinking hard, and this morning when Margaret came into her room without knocking, her eyes were very dark indeed. Mother. Clara sat up. What's happening? Nothing that concerns you. Margaret moved to the window, stood with her back to her daughter. I need you to stay in the house today and tomorrow. No calls, no visits to the Harrington girls, nothing outside this property. Because of the judge. Margaret's spine straightened almost imperceptibly. Where did you hear about the judge? Everyone heard him, Mother. He wasn't exactly quiet. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. What did he want? What are these irregularities he mentioned? I heard him say that word from the top of the stairs. Clara. Margaret turned. Her voice had that quality it got sometimes, not loud, not harsh, but absolutely final, like a door clicking shut. I am handling it. I need you to trust me and stay in this house. Can you do that? Clara looked at her mother. She was 18, and she was not stupid. She'd spent her entire life watching her mother manage things, manage guests, manage finances, manage Eleanor, manage the story the family told about itself. She knew what her mother's managing looked like, and she knew the difference between the managing that cleaned up real messes and the managing that created them. She also knew what she'd heard Judge Reed say in that hall, in that even immovable voice. No death certificate, no record of emigration, no notice of incapacitation. She knew what that meant. She'd known in the quiet part of herself she didn't look at directly for a long time. Yes, Mother, she said. Margaret looked at her for one more moment, then nodded once and left. Clara sat in the silence her mother left behind and stared at the wall between her room and the east wing. Nathaniel Reed had not slept much either. He was at the writing table in his room at the Hartwell Inn before the sun was properly up, the estate documents spread in front of him, a second cup of coffee, going cold at his elbow. He'd been over these papers 4 times since arriving in Whitmore Village the previous afternoon, and every time he read them, the same 2 facts pressed at him from opposite sides like a vice. Fact: The first Edmund Whitmore's estate, as submitted to the federal court by Solicitor Henshaw, reflected a straightforward inheritance structure: property and holdings transferred entirely to the surviving widow Margaret Whitmore, with a modest trust established for Clara Whitmore, contingent on marriage. No mention of Eleanor Whitmore. No provision for Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor Whitmore, as far as this document was concerned, had never drawn breath. Fact. The second Edmund Whitmore's original federal land grant, the one on record with the land office in Boston, filed 12 years prior, and not subject to amendment by any private solicitor, listed two heirs by name: Margaret Whitmore and Eleanor Whitmore, daughter. You could not erase a federal land grant. You could not modify it without the signature of both heirs witnessed and notarized on file with the land office. No such modification had ever been filed, which meant Eleanor Whitmore was legally on paper the co-heir to an estate worth approximately $60,000, and the document that should have formalized that inheritance had simply omitted her existence. Nathaniel pressed two fingers against his mouth and looked at the papers. He'd been a judge long enough to know the difference between an oversight and a crime. Oversights happened when people were careless. What he was looking at required intention, required coordination between a widow, a solicitor, possibly a physician, required the disappearance of a living person so thorough that she'd never been declared dead, because declaring her dead would have required a body. He'd gone looking for a grave yesterday. There was no grave. He hadn't expected one. But he'd needed to see the groundsman's face when he asked, and the groundsman, young Thomas, barely 20, uncomfortable in his own boots, had looked so entirely confused by the question that Nathaniel had understood Thomas didn't know where Eleanor Whitmore was buried, because Eleanor Whitmore wasn't buried. And then he'd looked up at the east wing, and she had been standing at the window. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, breathed out, and picked up his coffee. She was thin. Even from that distance, even through glass, he'd registered it, the way she held herself carefully, as though she wasn't sure how much energy she had to spare. Dark circles he could see across a garden. Hair unset loose around her shoulders in a way that no woman of her social standing would allow if she had any choice about it. She'd been in that room for a long time. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the folded paper. He'd found it in the roses at first light. The hairpin had caught the dawn and winked at him. He'd unfolded it on the garden path and read it twice, standing still, while the morning heat built around him, and he'd felt something cold and clean move through his thinking. 4 words, written in charcoal in a controlled, educated hand that didn't shake, even though the person writing it had every reason in the world to shake. The will was changed. Not "please help me," not "I am being kept prisoner," not the pleading, desperate language he might have expected from someone who'd been locked in a room for 3 years. The will was changed. She had given him exactly what he needed to hear. Nothing more. Nothing less. He put the coffee down, picked up his pen, and started writing. By mid-morning, Nathaniel was back at the Whitmore estate. He had not sent word ahead. He'd learned in 6 years on the circuit that sending word ahead of a visit gave people time to prepare their faces, and he was not interested in Margaret Whitmore's prepared face. He'd seen it yesterday. It was an impressive face, composed, gracious, faintly injured in a way calculated to inspire protectiveness in men who weren't paying close attention. He was paying very close attention. Vera answered the door. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him yesterday, that particular blend of relief and terror that he associated with servants who wanted to tell him something and were afraid of what would happen if they did. "Judge Reed," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore isn't—" "I'm not here to see Mrs. Whitmore." He held out a formal document folded and sealed with the circuit court stamp. "This is a notice of property inspection under federal jurisdiction pursuant to the land grant discrepancy on file in Boston. I have the right to inspect the estate's financial records, the original household documents, and any relevant correspondence." He paused. "Today, if you please." Vera took the document. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not. I'll get the mistress." "Please do. I'll wait in the study." He did not wait to be shown. He walked past her toward the back of the house, where he'd noted a study door yesterday during his exterior inspection, and he opened it and went in. The study was full of paper. Not disordered Margaret Whitmore was not a careless woman. Everything was filed labeled, stacked in precise arrangements. But the volume of it told him something. She had been managing this estate's paperwork herself without trusting a household manager, which meant she had things in these files she did not want anyone else reading. He did not touch anything. He stood in the center of the room with his hands behind his back and read the file labels on the shelves with his eyes. Household accounts, 1813. Household accounts, 1814. Medical correspondence, Dr. P. Graves. He looked at that one for a moment. Then he looked away and kept reading labels. Edmund Personal, Edmund Business, Estate Current, Trust Clara. No file labeled Eleanor. No file labeled with any name that might apply to a second daughter. That absence was itself information. He heard Margaret's footsteps before she reached the door, that particular cadence controlled and deliberate, and he turned to face the doorway just as she filled it. She looked at the document Vera had handed her. She looked at him. "Judge Reed," she said, and her voice was smooth as polished wood, not a single splinter showing. "I do wish you'd given me the courtesy of advance notice. I'd have had Mr. Henshaw here to—" "Mr. Henshaw's presence isn't required for a property inspection." Nathaniel met her eyes. "I'll need the original Whitmore household ledgers for the past 4 years. The medical correspondence in that file marked Graves and any documentation related to the modification of Edmund Whitmore's will." Something moved behind her eyes. Just a flicker. Gone before he could name it. "I'm afraid I don't have the original will in my possession," she said. "Mr. Henshaw." "The ledgers, then. Today." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and called out in a pleasant voice for Thomas. While Thomas went for the ledgers under Margaret's careful direction, careful in that way that told Nathaniel she was deciding what to hand over and what to leave behind. Nathaniel walked to the window. The east wing was visible from here. Third window up on the right. The glass was empty. He pulled out a small notebook and made a notation: medical file, Dr. Graves. Accelerated timeline. Possible commitment proceedings. He underlined the last 2 words. He'd seen this before. Not often, but enough. The legal mechanism that allowed a family member to have a relative declared incompetent and placed under institutional care. It was blunt and brutal and almost entirely irreversible once the paperwork was complete, because courts tended to defer to licensed physicians and the families who brought them forward. You needed a physician willing to sign the certification, a guardian willing to bring the petition, and a target who had no legal standing to object. Eleanor Whitmore currently had no legal standing. She was legally non-existent, which meant if Margaret Whitmore moved to have her committed, and Nathaniel had the sudden cold conviction that this was precisely what the accelerated timeline of the estate filing meant, there would be nothing Eleanor could do about it, unless someone gave her legal standing first. He put the notebook away and turned back into the room as Thomas arrived with an armful of ledgers. Margaret 2 steps behind him, watching Nathaniel with those composed, measuring eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." He picked up the first ledger. "I'll need an hour." "Of course," she said warmly. "I'll have refreshments sent in." She left. He opened the ledger. He did not touch the refreshments when they came. Clara had been watching from the upper landing for 20 minutes before she made herself move. She'd watched Judge Reed arrive. She'd watched her mother's face change and change back again in the span of one breath. She'd watched Thomas carry the ledgers, and she'd stood at the top of the stairs with her hand on the banister. Her mother's voice in her head. "Stay in the house. Trust me. I'm handling it," and her own mind running in a different direction entirely. She had grown up in this house. She knew every room, every habit, every silence. She knew what handling it looked like when it was legitimate, and she knew what it looked like when it wasn't. She went to the east wing. She did not have the key. Her mother kept it on her person. But she'd noticed at 14 that the lock on Eleanor's door was not the original hardware. It was a newer bolt installed after Edmund's death, and whoever had installed it had done so without properly seating the plate, which meant if you applied pressure at the right angle. Clara pressed her shoulder against the door, felt the plate give slightly, and said very quietly, "Eleanor, it's Clara. Can you hear me?" A silence. Then from the other side, "I can hear you. I can't get the door open, but I need you to listen." Clara kept her voice barely above a breath. "Mother sent 2 letters this morning. I didn't see who they went to, but I saw her face after she wrote them, and I know what her face looks like when she's decided something." A pause. "What kind of something?" Clara swallowed. "The kind that can't be undone." Another silence. Longer. "Thursday," Eleanor said quietly. Clara blinked. "How did you?" "She told me to stay in this wing for several days." She said it carefully, the way she says things when she's setting a boundary she expects to enforce. Several days means she expects this to be resolved by Friday. A pause. "The judge said he's in the village until Friday." Clara pressed her forehead against the door. "Eleanor, I think Mother is going to try to have you sent somewhere, before the judge can—" "I know." Eleanor's voice was quiet and completely level. "Clara, I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to get a message to Judge Reed. A long beat. Mother will see. Not if you're careful." A pause. "Clara, I've spent 3 years being careful. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do this." Nathaniel was midway through the 3rd ledger when he heard the soft knock at the study door. It was not Margaret's knock, too tentative. "Come in," he said. The girl who entered was young 18 perhaps, dark-haired with gray eyes that were taking in too much information too fast, the way eyes do when their owner is frightened and trying not to show it. She closed the door behind her with both hands, making no sound. "Miss Whitmore, I presume," he said. She startled. "How did you— You look like your father, the portraits in the East Corridor." He set the ledger aside. "Sit down." She sat perched at the edge of the chair across from him and held out a small folded piece of paper with both hands, the way you offer something you're not sure will be accepted. He took it, unfolded it. The handwriting was different from the charcoal note. This was written in ink in a deliberate contained script that told him the writer had chosen every word with surgical precision. "Judge Reed, my stepmother intends to have me transferred to a private medical institution no later than Thursday morning under a guardianship certification signed by a physician named Graves. The original will not the document submitted to the federal court, but the true original, witnessed by 2 men named Aldous Carter and Frederick Moore, is in a false-bottomed document case in the east study below the 3rd shelf on the left wall. The case is inlaid rosewood with brass fittings. You will not find my name on anything in that room, but you will find the case. E.W.W." Nathaniel read it twice. Then he looked up at Clara. "She told you where this was. She knew about it because Father showed it to her." Clara's voice was unsteady. "Before he got sick, he showed her where he kept the real copies of things because he said—" She stopped, steadied herself. "He said he didn't entirely trust the solicitor." Nathaniel was already standing. "Where is your mother right now?" "She went to the kitchen garden. She goes every morning at this hour for about 20 minutes. He looked at his watch. Then he looked at the door. "Come with me," he said. The east study was smaller than the main one, a private room not for receiving visitors lined with shelves, and the faint smell of pipe tobacco that had seeped into the wood years ago and stayed. Nathaniel moved directly to the left wall, 3rd shelf, and found the document case exactly where Eleanor had said it would be. Rosewood brass fittings sitting unremarkably between 2 stacks of correspondence, as though it were nothing. He lifted it. It was heavier than it looked. He pressed on the base, found the seam pressed harder, and the false bottom released with a sound like a soft exhale. Inside 2 documents folded together, tied with a faded blue ribbon. He unfolded the first one, Edmund Whitmore's last will and testament, dated 1811, witnessed by Aldous Carter and Frederick Moore. Clear, unambiguous language. My estate in its entirety, to be divided equally between my beloved wife, Margaret Constance Whitmore, and my daughter, Eleanor Grace. Whitmore to be administered jointly until such time as Eleanor Whitmore reaches the age of 25, at which point her full share reverts to her sole control. He stood in that room and felt something settle in his chest. Not satisfaction exactly, something quieter. The particular feeling he got when the last piece of a thing slid into place and the shape of the whole became undeniable. "Is that?" Clara began. "Yes." He refolded the document carefully. "Yes, it is." He looked at the second document. It was shorter, a letter in Edmund Whitmore's hand addressed to no one. A private note unsealed. Nathaniel read the first 2 lines and stopped. "If you are reading this, and I am gone, then something has gone wrong. I suspected in my final months that certain arrangements were being made without my knowledge. I was too weak to confront it directly. I am trusting that this document finds honest hands." Nathaniel set both papers back in the case, closed it, and tucked it under his arm. "Miss Whitmore," he said to Clara, "I need you to go back to your room, right now. Do not tell your mother you spoke to me. Do not tell her you came to this study. Can you do that?" Clara was staring at the case under his arm. Her face had gone very pale. "She's my mother," she said softly. "I know." His voice was not unkind. "And she is also someone who has committed serious crimes against your sister. Those 2 things are both true, and they're both going to have consequences." He looked at her steadily. "But the consequences have to happen in the right order. And right now the right order starts with you going back upstairs." Clara stood. She looked at the door. She looked at him. She looked at the floor. And then she nodded once quickly and left. Margaret found him in the main study, 10 minutes later, exactly where she'd left him, sitting at the desk with the ledgers open in front of him, the document case nowhere in evidence. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with that prepared face expression. "Have you found what you needed?" "I believe so." He closed the ledger. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to give you an opportunity to speak honestly with me before I return to Boston." Something shifted in her expression, just slightly. "I beg your pardon. I want to give you an opportunity," he said again pleasantly, "to tell me anything you'd like me to know about the estate, about the will, about Eleanor Whitmore, before I file my findings with the Federal Circuit Court." He looked at her. "I find in my experience that people appreciate having that opportunity. Some of them take it." The silence that followed was the most honest thing Margaret Whitmore had done all morning. She looked at him across that study, and for one moment, just one, the prepared face slipped entirely, and what was underneath was not the cartoon villainy of a woman who'd never suffered or wanted anything. What was underneath was something much more human and much more frightening, a woman who had convinced herself entirely and without remainder that what she had done was necessary, that the world owed her this, that a stepdaughter, inconvenient, inherited a legal obstacle, was simply a problem to be managed, and managing it efficiently was not cruelty, it was practicality. Nathaniel had seen that expression before too. He knew there was no argument that reached it. "I have nothing to add to what the estate documents already reflect," Margaret said. Her voice was perfectly composed. He stood. "Then I'll say good day, Mrs. Whitmore." He retrieved his hat from the side table, tucked the ledger he'd brought with him back into his case, and beneath it, flat against the leather bottom of the case, the rosewood box with its brass fittings and its red ribbon and its 2 documents that changed everything. He rode back toward the village at a pace that felt unhurried. He was already composing the emergency petition in his mind before the estate gates closed behind him. That same afternoon, while Nathaniel Reed sat at the desk in his room at the Hartwell Inn and wrote faster than he'd written anything since his first year on the bench, Margaret Whitmore stood in the private east study and noticed the weight was wrong. She stood in front of the left-hand shelf's 3rd row, and she looked at the space where the document case had been sitting, and she looked at it for a very long time. She did not make a sound. She turned and walked to the bell pull and rang for Thomas. "Yes, ma'am?" "Have my horse saddled," she said. "I need to ride to the village." Thomas looked at her. "Now, ma'am, it's—" "Now, Thomas." She was already moving toward the stairs, toward her room, toward the locked box where she kept her personal correspondence, the letters she kept as insurance, as leverage, as the kind of documentation that reminded people what they owed her and why. Her hands were shaking. She did not notice. Or perhaps she noticed and had no time to care. Upstairs behind a locked door, Eleanor Whitmore sat on the edge of her bed and watched the afternoon light move across the floor and waited. She had given Clara the instructions. She had written the note. She had told Judge Reed what he needed to know and where to find what he needed to find. She had done everything she could do from inside this room. Now the room felt different. Not larger, it was the same dimensions it had always been. But something in it had shifted. The air had changed. She had waited 3 years to feel this way, and she had not known before now what it would feel like. It felt like a door that someone was finally on the other side beginning to open. It also felt terrifying, because doors swung both ways, and she had been afraid for so long that being afraid of hope felt almost the same as being afraid of everything else. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. Somewhere in the village, a man was writing. She was going to trust that. She was going to trust it, because she had 4 words written in charcoal and a hairpin and a gray morning when he'd stood on a garden path and looked up at her window and tipped his hat like she was a real person and not a rumor. The will was changed, she had told him, and he had moved. She did not know what Friday would bring. She only knew that it was coming, and that for the first time in 3 years, she was not facing it alone. The letter reached Dr. Graves by late afternoon. He read it twice at his desk in his medical office in Concord, and then he folded it and held it against his sternum for a long moment, the way a man holds something that is both exactly what he expected and still somehow worse than he'd prepared for. He had known when Margaret Whitmore first came to him 8 months ago that the arrangement was not precisely ethical. He was not a man who spent a great deal of time examining the ethics of arrangements that paid well. He had debts. He had a wife who had grown accustomed to a certain quality of household. He had told himself in the particular way that men tell themselves things they do not entirely believe, that the girl was troubled, that the family had legitimate concerns, that his role was simply to provide documentation that reflected a medical assessment, and surely that was not so very different from what he did every day. He had not met Eleanor Whitmore. He had never examined her, never spoken to her, never sat in the same room with her. He had signed his name to a preliminary certification of mental instability based on Margaret Whitmore's detailed written account of her stepdaughter's behavior, and he had deposited the payment and not thought too carefully about any of it since. He was thinking carefully now. Thursday morning, before dawn. She will not come willingly. He read that line again. Then he put the letter in his coat pocket, stood up, and went to pour himself a drink. He stood at the window while he drank it, and he thought about what a federal judge arriving at the Whitmore estate meant for the kind of paper trail that led, if someone followed it carefully enough, directly to his office. He finished the drink. He poured another. By the time the second glass was empty, Dr. Graves had made a decision that was not courageous exactly. It was too frightened at the edges to be called courageous, but that was at its core the right one. He sat back down at his desk and began to write a different kind of letter. This one was addressed to the Federal Circuit Court in Boston. Nathaniel did not know about Dr. Graves's letter yet. He was still at his desk at the Hartwell Inn, writing his own, and the pile of completed pages beside him had grown considerably since the afternoon began. He had the will. He had Edmund Whitmore's private letter. He had the ledgers which told their own story in the dry language of numbers, specifically the entry in the 1813 household accounts marked medical consultation ongoing that corresponded to payments made monthly to a P. Graves, M.D. Regular payments. Substantial ones. The kind of payments that implied a long and cooperative professional relationship rather than a standard physician's call. He had enough. He knew he had enough, because he'd been doing this long enough to know the feeling, that particular alignment of facts when the shape of the crime becomes impossible to argue around, when the only remaining questions were procedural rather than evidentiary. The procedural questions were not small. They were, in fact, the thing keeping him awake. He could file the emergency petition with the circuit court. He had done so. He'd dispatched a writer to Boston 2 hours ago with the first set of documents with instructions to have them before the duty clerk before morning. The will alone was enough to freeze any inheritance transfer. The false bottom case and its contents were enough to open a formal fraud investigation. Margaret Whitmore's solicitor would find himself in a conversation with the federal court before the end of the week, and that conversation would not go well for him. All of that was procedural. All of that would happen. The thing that kept him writing the thing he could not stop turning over was Thursday. If Margaret had already engaged Graves, if the commitment papers were already being prepared, if she moved on Thursday morning before dawn, as the note suggested before his petition had worked its way through the court system before an injunction could be properly issued, then Eleanor would be gone, transferred to a private institution under a guardianship order. And once that happened, once she was inside those walls and labeled incompetent on a signed physician's certificate, getting her out again became a legal battle that could take months, years. He had a document case with a genuine will in it. He did not have an injunction. He needed to move faster than the paperwork. He stood up, pulled on his coat, and went downstairs to find the innkeeper. "I need to send another writer tonight," he said, "to the county sheriff." The innkeeper, a stout man named Prescott, who had said very little since Nathaniel's arrival, beyond what was strictly necessary, looked at him over the top of his spectacles. "Tonight. Within the hour, if possible." Nathaniel set coins on the counter. "And I'll need to know, is there a justice of the peace in this county who is not in the habit of taking supper at the Whitmore estate?" Prescott looked at the coins. He looked at Nathaniel. Something in his expression shifted not warmly exactly, but with a kind of cautious recognition, the way people look at someone who might actually do something about a situation they've been watching go wrong for a long time. "Judge Amos Farwell," Prescott said. "Lives 3 miles east. He and old Edmund Whitmore weren't what you'd call friendly." "Why not?" "On account of Mrs. Whitmore." Prescott's voice went flat. "Something happened back when Edmund was still alive. Nobody talks about it plainly, but Farwell's the kind of man who notices when things ain't right, and Mrs. Whitmore has made sure he didn't get invited anywhere important since the funeral." Nathaniel picked up his hat. "I'll need directions," he said. In the east wing, the candle had burned down to a stub. Eleanor did not light another one. She sat in the dark and listened to the house the way she'd learned to listen to it. The particular language of footsteps, of doors, of voices that carried through walls and floors and across the dead air of a house that had stopped being a home 3 years ago. She heard Margaret come in from riding sometime around dusk. Heard the sharp, clipped exchange with Thomas in the front hall. Not words she could make out, but the cadence of someone who was angry and suppressing it, which was its own kind of language. Heard the heavy footsteps going to the study. Heard a desk drawer opened and closed hard. She heard Margaret come to the east wing. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Eleanor sat very still. The footsteps did not continue. The key did not turn. For a long moment, there was only the sound of someone standing on the other side of a door, and Eleanor understood, with the particular intelligence of someone who had spent years reading people through walls and locked doors, that her stepmother was on the other side doing exactly what she was doing, listening, learning what the silence held. "Sleep well, Eleanor," Margaret said finally through the wood. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. That pleasantness, more than any threat, sent a cold current straight through Eleanor's chest. Margaret was only pleasant like that when she had already decided something, when the deciding was done and the doing was already in motion. "Good night, Margaret," Eleanor said. She kept her voice level. It cost her something to do it, but she kept it level. The footsteps moved away. Eleanor put her back against the wall beside the door, drew her knees up to her chest, and breathed slowly and deliberately until her heart stopped hammering. Thursday. If Clara was right, if she'd read her mother correctly, Thursday morning before dawn. She looked at the window. The night outside was heavy, and still the summer dark, full and warm and indifferent. She thought about the note she'd sent. About Clara's pale face, about Judge Reed standing in the garden with the morning light behind him, looking at her window with that steady, unhurried attention. She thought about what it meant that Margaret had come back from the village angry. He had the documents. He must have the documents, otherwise Margaret would have come through that door, not stood outside it being terrifyingly pleasant. The pleasant voice meant Margaret still believed she was ahead, believed she could still move fast enough. Eleanor pressed her hands against her knees. She could not run. She had nowhere to go, even if she could get the door open, and she couldn't get the door open. She could not send another message. She had no paper, no charcoal, and the window drop had been a one-time opportunity she could not replicate without being seen. What she could do was stay awake. What she could do was be ready for what she didn't entirely know. But 3 years of having nothing to do but think had taught her one thing about impossible situations. They always had a seam somewhere, a place where the impossible part was thinner than it looked. You found it by staying awake and staying precise and not letting fear make your thinking soft. She stayed awake. She watched the dark. Judge Amos Farwell was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been considerably larger and had shrunk inward rather than downward, with white eyebrows that moved independently of his face in a way that expressed significant legal opinion without requiring words. He opened his door at 8:30 in the evening, took one look at Nathaniel on his porch, and said, "You'd better come in." He had apparently already heard about the federal judge who'd arrived at the Whitmore estate with inconvenient questions. Small counties moved information the way water moved downhill inevitably and by the path of least resistance. Nathaniel put the document case on Farwell's kitchen table, opened it, and laid out both documents. Farwell read the will without touching it, bending over the table with his hands clasped behind his back, his white eyebrows ascending steadily. Then he read Edmund's private letter. Then he straightened and looked at Nathaniel with the expression of a man confirming something he'd suspected for a long time and taken no pleasure in being right about. "I knew Edmund Whitmore for 20 years, he said. "I knew something was wrong when he died and the eldest girl wasn't at the funeral. Margaret said she was too ill to attend." He paused. "I said I'd like to see the physician's note. Margaret stopped inviting me to things after that. I need 2 things from you," Nathaniel said. "I need a witness signature on the petition I've already filed a local judicial authority to accompany the federal filing and establish immediate jurisdictional standing. And I need a county law officer who will act on a lawful order without consulting Mrs. Whitmore first." Farwell's eyebrows moved. "You think she has people in the county office? I think she has supper there regularly." Nathaniel met his eyes. "I'm not imputing corruption. I'm saying that institutional loyalty is a real thing, and I don't have time for conversations about it." Farwell was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a chair out from the table, sat down, and reached for a pen. "Deputy Thomas Crane," he said, dipping the pen. "He's 26, and he grew up on the Whitmore tenant lands, and he's never once taken a meal in Margaret Whitmore's house because she doesn't invite tenant farmers' sons to her table." He paused. "He's also the best deputy in this county, and he does what the law tells him to do, which is a rarer quality than it sounds." Nathaniel sat down across from him. "I need him at the Whitmore estate before dawn on Thursday," he said. "With a court order, I will have ridden from Boston by Wednesday night." Farwell looked up from the document he was signing. "You're riding to Boston and back inside 2 days. I have a fast horse and a legitimate reason." Nathaniel held out his own pen. "Sign it twice, once as witness, once as local judicial authority. Date it today." Farwell signed. Clara had not gone to bed. She had told her mother she had a headache, which was true in the way that things can be literally true, and also entirely beside the point, and she had gone to her room and sat by the window and tried very hard to make herself not think about the document case, or the look on Judge Reed's face when he'd read what was inside it, or the fact that Eleanor was on the other side of a locked door 30 feet away, and had been on the other side of that locked door for 3 years, and Clara had known, and had not done anything. She had not done anything because her mother had been very precise in explaining what doing anything would mean. For the family. For Clara's prospects. For the future that Margaret had been quietly and efficiently constructing for her younger daughter, built on the foundation of an estate that she now understood with nauseating clarity was not entirely Margaret's to build with. She had known it wasn't right. She had told herself it was complicated. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and breathed and thought about the look on Eleanor's face. She hadn't seen Eleanor's face in 2 years. Margaret had stopped allowing it, but she remembered what it looked like before, and she was filling in the rest, from the thinness she'd seen through the cracked door when she'd pressed her shoulder against it that morning, and the combination of remembered and imagined was enough to make her throat close. She heard her mother's door open, late past 10. Heard her mother move through the house with that deliberate quiet, the kind of quiet that is not peaceful, but purposeful. Clara counted to 60 after the sound stopped. Then she got up. She moved through the dark hall in her bare feet, not toward Eleanor's door this time, but toward the back stairs. Down to the kitchen, out the kitchen door into the summer night. She had Thomas Crane's house in her mind. She'd grown up knowing every tenant and worker's family in a 5-mile radius. Her father had made sure of it. Sunday visits, names memorized. Thomas Crane lived a mile down the East Road in the small house with the vegetable garden his mother kept. She did not know if he would help. She did not know if anything she was doing made any difference at all, or if she was just a frightened 18-year-old girl walking through the dark to a farmhouse because it was the only thing she could think of to do with the guilt that had been living in her chest for 3 years. She walked anyway. Thomas Crane opened his door at the knock and found Clara Whitmore on his porch in her nightgown, with her hair loose and her feet bare, and her face carrying an expression he'd seen before, not on her, but on people who'd been carrying something heavy for too long and finally decided to put it down. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully. "I know it's late," she said. I know, but Judge Farwell sent word this afternoon that he needed to speak with you. And I don't know if you've gotten that message yet, and I need to know that there is someone. Her voice broke slightly. She steadied it. My mother is going to move Eleanor to an institution on Thursday morning, before anyone is awake enough to stop it. And I can't stop it myself, and I don't have anyone else to go to, and Miss Whitmore. He said it quietly, not interrupting exactly, just slowing her down. I did get Judge Farwell's message, an hour ago. She stopped. I was already getting dressed, he said. Clara put one hand over her mouth. Thomas Crane stepped back from the door. Come inside. It's warm enough, and you don't have shoes. By Wednesday morning, Nathaniel was already writing. He'd left the Hartwell Inn before first light, the document case strapped across his saddle, the signatures he needed folded inside his coat. He pushed the horse hard on the road to Boston, not cruel but purposeful, the way you ride when every hour has weight to it, and you can feel the hours ticking. He reached the circuit court by midday, still road dusty, and went directly to the duty clerk without stopping. Judge Nathaniel Reed, he said, Federal Circuit. I need the duty judge. The clerk looked at him, looked at the state of his coat. He's in. I'll wait 30 seconds, Nathaniel said pleasantly. Then I'm going in. The duty judge, a man named Harrington, whom Nathaniel had appeared before twice in the past 3 years, came out of his chambers in 31 seconds, with the expression of a man who had been interrupted and intended to express that. He took one look at the document Nathaniel was already holding out, and his expression changed. He read it standing in the hallway. He read Edmund's letter. He looked up. This is the genuine article, he said. It was not a question. Witnessed by 2 men I've already sent riders to locate, Nathaniel said. Aldous Carter is a merchant in Plymouth. Frederick Moore died in 1812, but his widow and eldest son are in Salem and can speak to his hand. Harrington handed the documents back. What do you need? An emergency injunction against any transfer of Eleanor Whitmore from the Whitmore estate in Whitmore County, effective immediately, and a formal order freezing all inheritance transfers connected to the Whitmore estate pending fraud investigation. Nathaniel paused. I need it today. I need to be riding back before sundown. Harrington looked at him for a moment. You rode from Whitmore County this morning? Yes. You're riding back tonight? Yes. On the same horse. I'm borrowing one from your clerk, Nathaniel said, with your permission. Something moved in Harrington's expression, something that might, in a more informal context, have been appreciation. He turned toward the clerk's office. Get him what he needs. And have someone bring food this man hasn't eaten since yesterday. Margaret discovered the document case was missing at 10:30 Wednesday morning. She had gone to the East Study for reasons that had nothing to do with the case. She'd wanted the correspondence file from 1812, and she had stood in front of the third shelf on the left wall and looked at the space where the rosewood box had been sitting for 3 years, and she had stood there for a very long time. She moved through the house after that, the way a cold front moves through summer air quickly, silently, and lowering the temperature of every room she passed through. She found Thomas in the stables. The federal judge, she said. When he was here yesterday, did he go to any rooms beyond the main study? Thomas looked at his boots. He asked me to fetch the ledgers from the... Did he go anywhere else in this house? Thomas looked up. He had the face of a young man who had not been given enough practice at lying to make a convincing job of it. He might have walked through the hall. Thomas. Her voice cut through his. Where did he go? The silence answered her. She turned and walked back into the house without another word. Upstairs, she knocked on Clara's door. She opened it without waiting for an answer. Clara was at her writing desk. She looked up with an expression of careful neutrality that her mother saw through immediately, because she had spent 20 years learning exactly what Clara's genuine neutrality looked like, and this was not it. You spoke to him, Margaret said. Clara set her pen down. I don't know who you mean. Don't. Margaret's voice was still quiet, still controlled, but the pleasantness was gone now entirely, the last of it burned away by the morning's discovery. Clara, look at me. Clara looked at her. I have built everything I have done, Margaret said with the particular intensity of someone stating what they believe to be an inarguable truth for you, for this family, for our standing, for a future that doesn't depend on the goodwill of men who can take it from us the moment they find it convenient. Everything. Every decision. She stopped. That girl has complicated something that was already settled. That girl, Clara said, is my sister. The air between them went absolutely still. Half-sister, Margaret said quietly. She is my sister. Clara said again, in exactly the same tone, and did not look away. Margaret studied her daughter for a moment that stretched out long and complicated. Then she walked out of the room and closed the door with careful precision, not slamming it, which would have been a release. Just closing it, which was a statement. Clara sat alone in the silence. Her hands were shaking against the desk. She was glad. She was terrified. She was both at once so thoroughly that she couldn't separate them. She was also absolutely certain for the first time in 3 years that she had made the right choice. Wednesday night arrived and Eleanor was still awake. She heard the clock in the downstairs hall mark every hour, and after midnight she stopped expecting sleep and simply accepted the vigil. She sat in the dark with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and she thought with the strange clarity that comes from exhaustion, past a certain point about what her life had been before this room. She remembered her father's study, the smell of it leather and old paper, and a particular blend of tobacco he ordered from Philadelphia. The way he'd read aloud to her sometimes not children's books, but real ones, the kind that assumed you were paying attention. She remembered him explaining the land grant to her when she was 15, not because she needed to know about legal documents, but because he believed she should know how the world actually worked underneath its surface arrangements. There are 2 copies of this, he'd said. One here, one with the land office in Boston. I want you to know that. Why? He had looked at her, and his face had held something she was too young then to fully read. She read it now 3 years in a locked room older. It was the look of a man who loved someone and was afraid for them and was doing the only thing he could think of to protect them that didn't require him to be alive to execute it, because knowledge of the thing he'd said is a kind of ownership of it. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. He'd known. He'd known something was wrong. His private letter said so. He'd been too sick to stop it directly. So he'd told her where things were, and he'd buried insurance documents in a false-bottomed case, and he'd trusted that if something happened, honest hands would eventually find them. She hoped with everything she had that the hands that found them were honest enough. She heard a sound at the window. Not a knock. Not possible, she was 2 floors up, but something striking the glass. Small. Deliberate. Once then, twice. She was at the window in 3 steps. In the garden below, barely visible in the dark, a figure stood looking up. Not Thomas, not anyone from the household. Broader in the shoulders, still in the particular way of someone who doesn't fidget. He tipped his hat. Eleanor pressed both hands against the glass. He reached into his coat and held something up toward her, a piece of paper. He couldn't throw it high enough, and they both knew it. But he held it up long enough for her to understand that it existed, and then he pointed to himself, then toward the front of the house, then held up 2 fingers. 2 hours. Or Wednesday. The second day. She looked at him. She spread both her hands on the glass. He nodded once. He was back. He had ridden to Boston and back, and he was standing in her garden at midnight, and whatever was on that paper, it existed, and he was still here. She watched him until he moved away from the garden, and then she stood at the window in the dark for a long time, breathing. At 2 in the morning, the sound she'd been dreading arrived. Not footsteps from the hall. A different sound from outside, the sound of hooves on the drive moving slow and deliberate, the sound of wheels, the sound of a conveyance pulling to a stop at the side entrance below the east wing. Not the front entrance, the side entrance, the one that didn't face the road. Eleanor moved to the window. She could see the side drive from the right-hand angle of the east wing window if she pressed her face close to the glass. She pressed. A carriage. 2 men on the box she didn't recognize, and a third man climbing down, compact, gray-haired, carrying a leather bag with the particular purposeful hold of someone who brought that bag everywhere and relied on its presence as a professional statement. Dr. Graves had arrived a day early. Margaret had moved the timeline. Eleanor stepped back from the window. Her heart was going very fast, but her thinking had gone very clear in the way it did when she was genuinely frightened. Not panicked, not frozen, but sharp and precise like cold water. She had heard Nathaniel in the garden 2 hours ago. She had seen the paper. She had read his signal. 2 hours or tomorrow, or I have what we need. But whatever he had, whatever that paper was, it was not in this room. She could not hold it in her hands. She could not present it to the men on the box or the physician with his leather bag. She could not get through the door. She went to the door anyway. She put both palms against it and she knocked. Not frantically, deliberately. 3 firm knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. "I know you're out there," she said, clearly loud enough to carry. "Someone is outside. Someone is listening." Silence from the hall. Then footsteps, a single set, moving toward her from the far end of the wing. Not her stepmother's step. Lighter. Younger. The footsteps stopped outside the door. "Eleanor." Clara's voice, barely a breath. "Something's happening. I woke up and I heard—" "I know." Eleanor pressed close to the door gap. "Clara, listen to me. Judge Reed is here. He's in the village or close to it. I saw him in the garden 2 hours ago." A sharp intake of breath. "Mother called the physician early. I heard the carriage." "You need to go to Judge Farwell's house right now," Eleanor said. "Go out the kitchen door, go fast, and don't stop." "I can't leave you, Clara." Eleanor's voice was steady, entirely steady, the steadiest it had been in 3 years. "You leaving is the only thing that helps me. Go." A long silence. In it, Eleanor heard the side entrance open below. Heard voices, Margaret's low and directing. Heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the main stairs, The back stairs. Moving upward. They were moving fast. "Clara," Eleanor said. "Now." She heard Clara's footsteps, soft, fast, receding toward the back of the house. Then she heard the back staircase creak closer now, and the jingle of the key in her stepmother's hand, and she stepped back from the door and turned to face it, and she stood as straight as she could stand, and she breathed, and she thought, "Hold on. Whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, hold on." Because he came back. He came back. The key turned in the lock. The door opened. Margaret Whitmore stood in the frame with the key still in her hand, and two men behind her. One Eleanor didn't know, built wide across the shoulders, with the particular blank professionalism of someone hired for a task rather than a cause. And Dr. Graves, who was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, gray-haired with a leather bag clasped in front of him like a shield. Margaret looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence had the quality of two people who had been on opposite sides of a locked door for 3 years and were now for the first time in the same room without the door between them, and both of them were recalibrating. Margaret moved first. Eleanor. Her voice was the pleasant one. The "I have already decided" voice. "This is Dr. Graves. He's come to assess your condition and arrange for your care at a proper facility. I think you'll find it considerably more comfortable than—" "No," Eleanor said. Margaret paused. "Just slightly." "I beg your pardon." "No." Eleanor said it again in the same even tone, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. 3 years ago, she would have screamed. 2 years ago, she would have begged. Tonight, she looked at her stepmother and said no the way you say a word you have been saving up for a long time and are finally spending. "I am not going anywhere with you or anyone you've hired. I am a legal heir to this estate. You know that. Dr. Graves knows that, or he will before this morning is out." Dr. Graves made a sound, not quite a word, more like a syllable that had lost its nerve halfway out. Margaret's pleasant expression did not waver, but something behind her eyes went very hard. "Eleanor, you are not well. You haven't been well for some time. Dr. Graves is here to help." "Has he examined me?" Eleanor asked. "Has he ever, in any professional capacity, examined me, spoken to me, sat in the same room with me before this moment?" Silence, because a certification of mental instability that has never involved an actual examination of the patient is not a medical document. Eleanor kept her eyes on her stepmother's face. "It's a piece of paper with a signature on it. And I imagine there is a federal judge who would find that distinction very interesting." Dr. Graves took a small, involuntary step backward. Margaret looked at him. The look said, "Do not move." He stopped. But the step had happened, and Eleanor had seen it, and she held that knowledge like a coal pressed to her palm, hot and painful and real. "This is not a negotiation," Margaret said quietly. "You have no legal standing. You have no rights I am required to recognize. The guardianship order is signed and witnessed. Dr. Graves's certification exists. Whatever story you have constructed in this room over the past 3 years, it ends tonight." She paused. "I am sorry it has to be this way. I want you to know that." "You're not sorry," Eleanor said, "and I don't want your apology. I want you to step back from that door." Margaret did not step back. She looked at the wide-shouldered man beside her and gave one precise nod. He moved toward Eleanor. Eleanor did not move away from him. She held her ground, which she knew was strategically meaningless. He outweighed her by 100 pounds, and the hallway behind them was his. But she held it anyway, because she had decided sometime in the last hour that she was done, entirely done with moving backward inside these walls. She had moved backward far enough. The man's hand closed on her arm. And from somewhere below them, from the front of the house, from the road, from the pre-dawn dark that was just beginning to gray at its edges, came the sound of hooves. Not one horse. Several. Margaret heard it at the same moment Eleanor did. Eleanor felt the grip on her arm loosen by exactly 1 degree, which was not freedom, but was information. She kept her eyes on her stepmother's face, and watched Margaret Whitmore do something Eleanor had never seen her do in 22 years. She hesitated. It lasted only a second. Then Margaret's jaw set, and she said to the man holding Eleanor's arm, "Get her to the carriage, now." "Ma'am?" Dr. Graves's voice came out higher than he'd apparently intended. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, I feel I should mention I sent a letter to the circuit court yesterday morning, before I left Concord." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Margaret turned to look at him very slowly. "I beg your pardon," she said. Dr. Graves had the expression of a man who had made a decision he believed was right, and was discovering that believing a thing is right does not make it painless. He was sweating visibly. His hands had gone white around the handle of his leather bag. "I disclosed the nature of my involvement with the certification. I felt, given the federal inquiry, that full disclosure was the appropriate professional." "You disclosed." Margaret's voice was almost inaudible. "Yes, ma'am." The hoofbeats outside were closer now. Eleanor could hear them clearly. 4 horses, maybe 5, moving at a controlled pace, up the estate drive, not galloping, but not slow either. The pace of people who know where they are going and have authority to be there. "Get her to the carriage," Margaret said again to the man holding Eleanor's arm, and her voice had lost the pleasantness entirely now. Just hard, bare instruction. "Whatever is happening outside, we will be gone before—" "Let go of her arm." The voice came from the doorway. Everyone in the room turned. Nathaniel Reed stood at the threshold of the East Wing with Deputy Thomas Crane 1 step behind him, and Judge Amos Farwell, white eyebrows, and all 1 step behind that. Nathaniel's coat was road-dusted and his boots were muddy, and his face held the particular expression of a man who had ridden through the night and arrived precisely where he intended to, and was not in any mood to be told otherwise. In his hand was a document folded and sealed with the circuit court stamp. "I said," he repeated, looking directly at the man holding Eleanor's arm, "let go of her arm." The man let go. Shud. The silence that followed had a different quality from any silence Eleanor had experienced in this house. The silences she knew were enforced ones heavy with the specific weight of a person powerful enough to impose them. This one was different. This was the silence of a room where the power had just changed hands, and everyone present was in the process of understanding that. Nathaniel walked in. Not fast, not aggressive. He walked in the way he'd walked everywhere Eleanor had observed him, with that unhurried certainty, as though he'd already run the calculations and liked the result. He went directly to the man who'd held Eleanor's arm, not to Margaret, and handed him the document. "Federal injunction," he said. "Signed by Circuit Duty Judge Harrington at the federal court in Boston, dated yesterday. It prohibits the removal of Eleanor Whitmore from this property and freezes all transfers of Whitmore estate assets pending investigation." He paused. "You'll want to read that before you do anything else tonight." The man took the paper. He read the first 3 lines. He took one large, definitive step away from Eleanor. Nathaniel turned to Dr. Graves. "You're Graves," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." Graves stood straighter with the air of someone trying to demonstrate good faith through posture alone. "I sent a full disclosure letter to the circuit court yesterday. I wanted on record that I—" "It is on record," Nathaniel's voice was level. "Your letter arrived 6 hours before I left Boston. It is currently in the hands of the court clerk and has been entered into evidence." A pause. "You'll be needed for a deposition. Don't leave Massachusetts." Graves nodded rapidly. Of course. Yes, sir." Nathaniel turned finally to Margaret. She was still standing where she'd been, between the door and the window, in the center of the room, in the center of everything she'd built and managed and maintained for 3 years. She looked at him with those composed, assessing eyes, and even now, even at 2:30 in the morning, with a federal injunction in the room, and Deputy Crane in the doorway, and Judge Farwell's white eyebrows expressing substantial legal opinion from the hall, she looked like a woman who had not entirely exhausted her options. That composure, Eleanor thought, was either the most frightening thing she'd ever seen or the saddest. She hadn't decided which. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nathaniel said, "I'll need you to accompany Deputy Crane to Judge Farwell's office. Tonight. There is a formal inquiry." "You cannot compel me to leave my own home at this hour," Margaret said, and her voice was completely steady. "Whatever documents you believe you have, my solicitor—" "Your solicitor," Nathaniel said, "is currently in a conversation with 2 federal marshals at his home in Boston. He was notified of the fraud investigation 3 hours ago. He has, I'm told, been quite forthcoming." A pause. "Mr. Henshaw is a man who understands when a situation has changed." Something moved in Margaret's expression. Just a flicker. Just enough. "The original will," Nathaniel continued, "is in federal custody. Edmund Whitmore's private letter is in federal custody. The ledger evidence of payments to Dr. Graves is in federal custody. And the testimony of Aldous Carter, who is alive and well in Plymouth, and has already confirmed his witness signature, is in federal custody." He held her gaze. "Ma'am, I'm not here to be dramatic about this. I'm here because the law requires it. Please come with Deputy Crane." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Eleanor. Eleanor did not look away. She looked back at her stepmother with the directness of someone who had spent 3 years in a locked room thinking about this exact moment, and what she felt was not triumph, not yet, not entirely, and not satisfaction. She felt something quieter and stranger. She felt the specific sensation of a weight that has been on you so long, you stop noticing it beginning very slowly to lift. "This is not finished," Margaret said. She said it to Eleanor, not to Nathaniel. "I know," Eleanor said quietly. It was not surrender, and it was not a threat. It was simply a true thing, and they both knew it. Courts took time. Investigations took time. The law's machinery was real, but it was slow, and whatever happened next would happen across months and proceedings and depositions and hearings, and none of it would be simple. But the key was out of Margaret's hand, and Eleanor Whitmore was standing on the right side of an open door. Margaret walked out of the room with Deputy Crane, and her footsteps going down the hall were the most ordinary sound Eleanor had ever heard in this house. Judge Farwell remained in the doorway, which was considerate of him because the room needed a moment, and he seemed to understand that. Nathaniel turned to Eleanor. She looked at him. This man she'd seen through glass, exchanged notes with in the dark, trusted with 4 words written in charcoal, and she was not entirely sure what she'd expected him to look like up close, in the same room with the emergency over and the silence settling. She thought she might feel something overwhelming. She thought there might be tears or shaking or some dramatic physical manifestation of 3 years of compressed terror finally releasing. What she actually felt standing in the wreckage of the room she'd lived in for 3 years with the door open behind him was very tired and very, very clear. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." He looked at her with that same steady attention he'd had in the garden. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Can you walk?" "I've been walking laps in this room for 3 years to keep my legs from going useless," she said. "Yes, I can walk." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Then let's get you out of this room, Miss Whitmore." She took 1 step toward the door, then stopped. She turned back and looked at the room, the narrow bed, the writing table, the window with the rose garden below it, the walls that had held her for 3 years, the floorboards she knew by touch in the dark. She had hated this room with a completeness that had no adjective adequate to it. She looked at it for exactly 5 seconds. Then she walked out and did not look back. Clara was in the front hall. She had not gone to Farwell's house after all. She'd gotten halfway down the East Road and turned back, unable to leave, unable to do anything but come back and be present for whatever happened. She stood in the hall in her nightgown with her hair loose and her bare feet on the cold marble, and when Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs, she made a sound that wasn't a word. Eleanor came down the stairs. Clara crossed the hall in 4 steps and put her arms around her sister. And Eleanor stood very still for a moment, the particular stillness of someone who has not been held by another person in a very long time and has forgotten slightly how to receive it. And then she put her own arms around Clara and held on. They stood like that for a while. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. When Eleanor stepped back, Clara's face was wet, and she didn't seem to have noticed. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry I didn't—" "Stop." Eleanor said it gently. "You're 18. You were a child when this started. You came to the door. You got the message to Judge Reed. You walked to Thomas Crane's house in the dark." She looked at her sister's face. "You did enough. You did more than enough." Clara pressed her lips together and nodded, not trusting her voice. Nathaniel had come downstairs behind Eleanor and stood at a respectful distance, occupied with reviewing the injunction paperwork with Judge Farwell in low voices. Thomas Crane had taken the two hired men, the wide-shouldered one, and the carriage driver, to a separate room to collect their information. Dr. Graves was sitting in the front parlor, with the look of a man waiting for a verdict he knew was coming and had decided to accept. The house, for the first time in 3 years, was full of the right kind of noise, purposeful procedural moving towards something rather than away from it. Eleanor looked around the front hall. She had not been in this part of the house since the day Margaret had locked her in the East Wing. 3 years. She had last stood in this hall when she was 19 years old, and her stepmother had looked at her and told her she didn't exist, and she had laughed because she'd thought it was absurd. She was not 19 anymore, but she was still standing here. That felt like something worth noting. Dad. By the time the first real light came up, Judge Farwell had established a temporary legal framework that would hold until the formal proceedings began in Boston. Eleanor was formally placed under Nathaniel's professional protection as the petitioning officer, which was a procedural necessity that meant she could not be compelled to remain on the property or to go anywhere she did not choose to go. Nathaniel explained this to her in the parlor, carefully, methodically, the way he explained legal things without condescension, but also without assuming she knew more than she did. And she listened to every word and asked 3 questions that made him pause slightly each time before answering the way people pause when they are recalibrating their assumptions about who they're talking to. "The original will leaves the estate jointly between you and Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "which is complicated by the fraud investigation. There will be a question of what she is legally entitled to retain, given the criminal nature of the arrangement. Your solicitor, you'll need one who is not Mr. Henshaw, will argue that the fraud constitutes grounds for full forfeiture. And the chances of that argument succeeding?" He considered. "Reasonable, not certain." "I'm not asking for certain," she said. "I'm asking for reasonable." "Then yes, reasonable." She nodded. "What happens to me in the meantime?" "You can't stay here. Not tonight. Judge Farwell has offered his home temporarily, and there are arrangements to be made in Boston for longer term." "I want to go to Boston," she said immediately. Then more carefully, "If that's possible, I want to be somewhere that is not this county for a while." Nathaniel looked at her. "That's possible. And Clara?" He'd expected that question. He could tell from the slight absence of surprise in his face. "Miss Clara has committed no crime and is not under any legal restriction. She can go where she chooses." "She'll come with me," Eleanor said. "She doesn't have anywhere else to go." "All right." She looked at him. This man who had ridden to Boston and back on her behalf, who had stood in her garden at midnight, tipping his hat, who had said, "If you are alive, and I believe you are," as though it were a legal argument rather than the most humane thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. "Why?" she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Why what? Why did you come back? You had the documents, you'd filed the petition. You could have sent a deputy and stayed in Boston and done this entirely by correspondence." She kept her eyes on his face. "Why ride through the night?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the petition takes time," he said. "And I wasn't sure time was what we had." A pause. "And because I read your note." 4 words, she said. "That's not much to ride a horse through the dark over." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Something in the way he said it closed the sentence in a way that was not an ending, more like a door left slightly open, the kind you don't close all the way because you intend to come back to it. Eleanor looked at the door he'd left open. She was too exhausted and too newly free, and too precisely aware of her own lack of steadiness to walk through any door tonight. But she noted it existed. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the hat." He looked at her. "The hat, the garden, the first morning." She held his gaze. "You tipped your hat at me. I hadn't been acknowledged by another person in a very long time." She paused. It mattered. Nathaniel Reed. Federal judge, 6 years on the circuit. A man who had been told by approximately everyone who knew him that he had no readable expression whatsoever, looked at Eleanor Whitmore in the gray morning light of her own front parlor, and felt something move through his chest that was not legal reasoning and not professional concern, and was not, if he was being precise about it, something he was going to examine closely right now. "You're welcome," he said. Outside, the summer morning was coming up the way summer mornings do in Massachusetts, slow and golden and indifferent to the dramas of the people standing in it. Thomas Crane had finished with the hired men and sent them on their way with a formal notice to appear for deposition. Dr. Graves had surrendered his leather bag for evidence and signed a voluntary statement that was 3 pages long, and would Nathaniel suspected be very useful to the prosecution. Judge Farwell had drafted the preliminary protective order and signed it with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting several years to sign something useful in relation to the Whitmore estate. Margaret had been taken to Farwell's office under Deputy Crane's supervision, which was not an arrest. Not yet, the formal charges would come from Boston, but was not an arrest either. She had gone without drama, which Eleanor somehow found the most unnerving thing about the entire morning. She had expected some final confrontation, some last argument, some attempt to turn the moment to her advantage. Margaret had simply walked out. Eleanor thought about that as she stood at the front door of the house she'd grown up in and breathed the outside air for the first time in 3 years. It came at her all at once, the heat, the smell of the roses and the grass and the summer dirt, the sound of birds doing their ordinary morning work, the particular quality of open air that you don't notice until you've been without it long enough. She breathed it in. She breathed it out. Clara came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Clara asked finally. "Right now, this morning." Eleanor thought about it. 3 years of wanting things she couldn't have had given her a very clear list. But the list felt strange now. Not invalid, but somehow different from outside the room than it had felt inside it. Like a map that was perfectly accurate but still required you to walk the actual territory. "I want breakfast," she said. "A real one. With things on it I chose myself." Clara made a sound that was half laugh, half something else. "I can do that." "And then," Eleanor said, "I want to start reading. Every legal document connected to this estate. Every letter, every filing, every piece of paper that has my name on it, or should have my name on it." She paused. "I spent 3 years knowing my rights existed, but having no power to act on them. That changes today." Clara looked at her. "You sound like Father." "Good," Eleanor said simply. She heard footsteps behind her. Nathaniel coming toward the door, hat in hand, ready to begin the next procedural piece of a morning that had many procedural pieces left in it. He stopped a respectful distance behind them. "Miss Whitmore, when you're ready." Eleanor turned to look at him over her shoulder. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. "I want to stand in the doorway a little longer." He nodded. No impatience, no qualification. She turned back to the morning. She stood in the doorway of her own house, and she breathed, and she looked at the sky and the garden and the road that ran past the gate, and she thought about what her father had said. Knowledge of a thing is a kind of ownership of it. She knew this estate. She knew its value, its history, its legal standing, its debt structure, its filing irregularities, its documents and their locations, and the specific false bottom of a rosewood box that had held her salvation for 3 years. She owned all of that. They had taken the room from her. They had taken the years from her. They had taken her name from the conversations of Boston society, and her chair from the dinner table, and her voice from every room in this house. But they had not taken her mind. They had not taken what she knew, or what she remembered, or what her father had quietly, deliberately handed her when he understood he was running out of time to protect her any other way. And this morning, standing in the door of the house that was by law and by blood and by the signature of a man who had loved her half hers, Eleanor Whitmore was beginning to understand something important. Recovery would not look like what she'd imagined from inside that room. It would be slower, more complicated, more full of paperwork and legal proceedings and depositions, and the thousand small humiliations of having to prove over and over in formal settings that you exist. But it would be real. It would be real in the way that the morning air was real, and the sound of the birds was real, and the warmth of the sun on her face was real, unarguable, undeniable, requiring no one's signature to authenticate. She breathed in. She breathed out. "All right," she said to the morning, to herself, to the man standing behind her who had tipped his hat at a ghost and meant it. "All right." She stepped forward. The ride to Boston took most of the day. Nathaniel had arranged 2 carriages, one for Eleanor and Clara, one for the evidence cases, and Judge Farwell, who had decided with the air of a man who had waited several years for something interesting to happen in his county, and was not about to let it conclude without him to accompany the party to the city. Thomas Crane rode alongside on horseback because someone needed to, and also because Thomas Crane had apparently decided that this particular matter was worth seeing through to its proper end. Eleanor sat inside the carriage with her hands folded in her lap and watched Massachusetts go by through the window and said very little for the first hour. Clara sat across from her and also said very little, which was its own kind of grace, the understanding that the person beside you has been in a very small room for a very long time and might need the large world to come at her slowly. The second hour, Eleanor started asking questions. Not about the legal proceedings, she'd already asked those. About Boston. About what had changed, what was different, what the city looked like now versus what she remembered from the last time she'd been there. Which was the spring of 1812, 3 years before her father's death, when she was 19, and the world had still seemed like a place that intended to include her. Clara answered carefully at first, then with more ease as she understood that Eleanor wasn't fragile in the way she'd feared, not brittle, not likely to shatter at the mention of social events she'd missed, or people who had moved on or changed. Eleanor listened to everything with the focused attention of someone taking inventory, cataloging what was the same and what was different, and filing it all away with methodical precision. She had spent 3 years with nothing to do but think. Her mind had not gone soft. If anything, it had sharpened in the way that things sharpen when they have nothing to work on but themselves. "The Harrington family," Eleanor said. "Are they still in Beacon Hill?" "Yes." "Why?" "Mrs. Harrington was father's solicitor's wife before Henshaw. She knows the property records of half of Boston. She'll know who the honest solicitors are now." Eleanor paused. "I'll need one who has no existing relationship with the Whitmore estate name." Clara looked at her. "You've been planning this." "I've had 3 years and no paper," Eleanor said. "I planned everything in my head. I have approximately 47 separate items on a mental list that I intend to work through in order." Clara stared at her for a moment. Then she said, "What's number 1? Breakfast, which we've done." Eleanor almost smiled. "Number 2 is a solicitor. Number 3 is a full review of every Whitmore legal filing for the past 4 years. Number 4 is a bath." She paused. "A real one. With hot water and more than a bar of yellow soap." Clara made the sound again, half laugh, half something that was trying not to be a sob. "I'll make sure of it." Outside the carriage, Nathaniel rode parallel on horseback close enough that Eleanor could see him through the window when she turned her head. He was not looking at the carriage. He was reading something in his saddle documents, probably because she had already established that Nathaniel Reed did not appear to know how to stop working, and his horse moved under him with the practiced ease of an animal that had been on many roads with this particular rider. Eleanor watched him for a moment. She turned back to the window. She had 47 things on her list. She did not have room right now for whatever that was. But she noted it. She was getting good at noting things and setting them aside with the intention of returning to them. 3 years in a room taught you that skill. Some things kept. Some things you came back to and found them still exactly where you'd left them, unchanged, waiting. She looked back out of the window and watched her state go by and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she'd taught herself to breathe when everything else was outside her control. She was going to Boston. She was going of her own free will. That was enough for right now. Boston received them with the indifference of a city that has too much happening to pause for any single story. Judge Farwell arranged temporary lodging, a respectable boarding house on Tremont Street, kept by a widow named Mrs. Aldridge, who asked no unnecessary questions, and provided clean rooms and adequate meals, which was, Nathaniel had discovered over 6 years of circuit work, the precise combination of qualities most useful in a crisis. Eleanor and Clara took adjoining rooms on the second floor. Eleanor's room was small, but had 2 windows, both of which opened, and she opened both of them immediately, and stood between them and breathed the city air, coal smoke and salt and horse and something baking somewhere nearby, and felt the specific vertigo of a person rediscovering that the world is very large. She slept for 11 hours. She hadn't intended to. She'd intended to stay awake and begin working through the list. Instead, she lay down on a real bed with real blankets in a room she'd chosen with unlocked doors on both sides, and she was asleep before she'd finished the thought that was going to keep her awake. When she woke, it was mid-morning, and Clara had left a note under her door. "Breakfast is warm downstairs. Take your time." See, she took her time. The first week in Boston moved fast and slow, in the way that weeks move when they contain both bureaucratic procedure and the fundamental reconstruction of a life. Nathaniel filed the formal fraud complaint with the circuit court on the first morning. Eleanor signed her name to it in his office, her full name, Eleanor Grace Whitmore, in the same controlled handwriting she'd used to write 4 words in charcoal on a menu card, and watched the clerk stamp it with the court seal, and felt the stamp land in her chest like a bell struck. She had legal standing now. She existed formally and on paper in the eyes of the Federal Court of Massachusetts. She was not going to let herself make too much of a moment that was, from the court's perspective, entirely procedural. But she let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds, the specific sensation of a name being written and witnessed and stamped and real. And then she moved on to the next item on the list. The solicitor came through Mrs. Harrington as Eleanor had predicted. His name was James Alcott, and he was 45, and had the careful, precise manner of someone who had built his reputation on not making promises he couldn't keep. He sat across from Eleanor in Mrs. Aldridge's small parlor on the 3rd day, and listened to the complete account of the past 3 years without interrupting once. And when she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment before he looked at her. "You've been managing the legal inventory of this situation from inside a locked room," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "For 3 years." "Yes." He looked at his notes again. "Miss Whitmore, I have to tell you the case as you've described it, combined with the evidence Judge Reed has already placed before the court, is substantial. The fraud is demonstrable. The will is genuine. The witness, Aldous Carter, has already given a deposition confirming his signature." He paused. "The question is not whether you will prevail. The question is how long it takes and what the court decides to do about Mrs. Whitmore's portion of the estate, given that the fraud was committed in pursuit of it. I want her portion to be determined by law, not by my preferences," Eleanor said. Alcott looked up. "I beg your pardon. Whatever the law says she is entitled to after the fraud is accounted for, that is what she should receive. Not more because I'm feeling generous, and not less because I'm feeling vindictive." Eleanor kept her eyes on his. "I want this done correctly. I want to be able to stand in front of any court in this country and say that every decision I made was the legally sound one and the ethically sound one. I don't want to win by doing anything she did." Alcott set his pen down. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone updating a significant assumption. "All right," he said. "Then let's talk about what the law actually says." The first twist nobody saw coming arrived on the 8th day in Boston, in the form of a letter. It was addressed to Eleanor at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, which meant someone knew she was there, which was its own minor alarm before she opened it. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar. Not Nathaniel's, not Alcott's, not Clara's deliberate script. She opened it at the breakfast table. It was from Aldous Carter. Not the deposition he'd already given to the court. This was a personal letter written in an old man's hand that was still steady enough to be legible, and it was 3 pages long, and by the time Eleanor reached the end of the second page, she had set down her coffee cup and was reading with both hands flat on the table because she needed something solid under her. Edmund Whitmore had written a second letter. Not the one in the false-bottomed case, a different one. An earlier one written a full year before his death, addressed to Aldous Carter personally. In it, Edmund had described in careful and specific detail his suspicions about Margaret's management of the estate accounts. He had described 3 specific transfers of cash from the estate holdings to accounts in Margaret's name alone that had occurred without his knowledge or consent while he was in the final stages of his illness. He had not confronted her directly because he did not have the strength for the confrontation and was afraid of what she might do if she knew he suspected. He had given Carter the letter for safekeeping. Carter had kept it. For 4 years, the man had kept it. He'd given his witness deposition to the federal court as requested, but the personal letter that he'd kept back. Not out of cowardness. Out of the same calculation Edmund had made when he hid the will wait for the honest hands. He'd been waiting to understand whether Eleanor was safe before he sent it. The last paragraph of Carter's letter read, "Your father trusted me with this because he said you were the kind of girl who would know what to do with it. I believe he was right. The enclosed letter is yours. Use it as you see fit." Eleanor sat at that breakfast table for a long moment. Then she picked up the letter and walked to the door and asked Mrs. Aldridge to send word to Judge Reed that she needed to see him this morning. Nathaniel arrived within the hour. He read the letter standing in Mrs. Aldridge's parlor, and Eleanor watched his face while he read that particular quality of attention he gave to documents, the way nothing in his expression moved while his eyes went fast across the lines. When he finished, he looked up. "This changes the financial component of the case substantially," he said. "How substantially?" "The 3 transactions Carter's letter describes, if they can be traced through the estate accounts, and given that we already have the ledgers, I believe they can represent a pattern of unauthorized appropriation that predates the will fraud by 14 months. He paused. "It shifts the charge from a single act of fraud at the time of Edmund's death to a sustained course of financial misconduct over multiple years." Eleanor looked at him. "In plain language." "In plain language," he said, "it means this was not a decision Margaret Whitmore made in a desperate moment after your father died. It means she was already taking from the estate while he was alive and too ill to stop her. And then she made his death the opportunity to finish what she'd already started." He set the letter down carefully. "It means this was premeditated. Over years." The room was quiet. Clara, who had been sitting in the corner with her sewing and not sewing, set the sewing down. Eleanor absorbed this. She had known in the general shape of it that her stepmother was not a person who acted impulsively. She had known the management of the East Wing, the slow elimination of Eleanor's legal existence, the careful cultivation of the physician relationship. All of it had the texture of something planned rather than panicked. She had known it the way you know things you've had 3 years to sit with. But knowing it in the abstract, and hearing Nathaniel Reed say premeditated over years in that quiet, precise voice, were 2 different things. "Clara," Eleanor said. Clara looked at her. "None of this is about you," Eleanor said. "Whatever comes out in the proceedings, whatever they find in those accounts, whatever the full picture looks like, your father loved your mother, and he married her, believing she was someone she wasn't, and that is not your fault. And your mother made choices that you did not make, and would not have made. That is not your fault either." Clara's face did something complicated. "Eleanor, I'm saying it now because I want it said before the proceedings get louder and messier and harder to hear through," Eleanor said. "You came to my door. You walked in the dark to Thomas Crane's house. You chose correctly when it was hard to choose correctly. That is who you are, not her." Clara pressed her lips together and nodded once very tight and picked her sewing back up and did not look at anyone for a moment. Nathaniel was looking at Eleanor with that expression she'd started to recognize, the one that wasn't quite readable, but wasn't quite closed either. She looked at him. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "I'll file the supplemental evidence this afternoon. I'll come with you." He paused. "To the court." "I have legal standing now," she said. "I'd like to use it." She went to the federal court building on a Thursday morning in the third week of August, and she walked up the steps under her own power, and she sat in the gallery while Alcott and Nathaniel presented the supplemental evidence to Judge Harrington, and she watched the proceedings with the focused attention of a student who knows this is the most important class she will ever take. Harrington reviewed the evidence. He asked 2 questions of Nathaniel and 3 of Alcott. He reviewed Carter's letter and Edmund's original letter side by side, and his expression did not change significantly, throughout which Eleanor had already learned to read as meaningful in its own right. Judges who were surprised showed it. Judges who were confirming what they already suspected did not. At the end of the session, Harrington made 3 rulings. First, the inheritance transfer of 1814 was formally voided, null and of no legal effect. Second, the Whitmore estate accounts were frozen, pending full forensic review of all transactions from 1811 forward. Third, a warrant was issued for Margaret Whitmore's formal arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and criminal misappropriation of estate funds. Eleanor heard each ruling and felt each one land differently. The first was relief, clean, structural, the framework of justice functioning correctly. The second was something more complicated, a recognition that the full accounting of what had been taken would take time and would not be painless. The third was the one she sat with longest, because it was the most human and the least legal. It was the moment the story Margaret Whitmore had told to Boston society, to the county, to herself, was formally declared false by a federal judge in an open courtroom. She did not feel triumph. She felt the absence of something that had been pressing on her for so long she'd forgotten it was a presence, like silence after a noise you've stopped hearing because it never stopped. She breathed in. She breathed out. She stood when the session was adjourned, and she walked out of the courtroom and down the steps into the August heat, and she stood on the pavement and tipped her head back and let the sun come at her face and did not care if anyone saw.
Button Shushvi.
Nathaniel found her there. He came down the steps and stood beside her, not too close. Not the careful professional distance he'd maintained for 3 weeks, either just beside her in the ordinary way of 2 people who have been through something together and are now standing in the aftermath of it. 3 rulings, Eleanor said without opening her eyes. Yes. The estate account review. How long will it take? Alcott estimates 4 to 6 months for a full accounting, possibly longer. A pause. You should prepare for the number to be larger than you expect. She opened her eyes and looked at him. You think she took more than what Carter described? I think a woman who was willing to erase her stepdaughter's legal existence and pay a physician to certify her insane was not limiting herself to 3 unauthorized transactions. His voice was even. I think the ledgers are going to tell a story that will take time to read completely. Eleanor nodded slowly. All right. You're not upset. I'm past being upset about things I can't change, she said. Whatever she took, we find it. Whatever the law says, she owes back, she owes back. Whatever is mine, I take back. She paused. The rest is just accounting. He looked at her for a moment. Miss Whitmore, he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly if it's inappropriate. She turned to face him. Ask. The East Wing. He said it carefully. When I found you when I looked up at that window the first morning, I want to understand what that was like. Not for the case. Not for any legal purpose. He held her gaze. I want to understand what it cost you. Nobody had asked her that. Not Alcott, who was focused on the legal architecture of the case. Not Judge Farwell, who was focused on the procedural aftermath. Not Clara, who understood too much of it to ask comfortably. She was quiet for a moment. It cost me the years, she said finally. "Not the suffering I managed, the suffering. I found ways to make the suffering manageable. But the years, the things I would have done, the person I would have become, the conversations I would have had, those don't come back." She paused. "I was 22 in a room I entered at 19. 3 years sounds like nothing when you say it quickly. It was everything that was supposed to happen during that time." He did not offer her a platitude. She appreciated that. "What does come back?" he said. She looked at him. It was not an abstract question. She could hear in his voice that he was asking something specific, asking whether there was a version of this that had a future tense. "Everything I kept," she said. "What I learned, what I planned, what I refused to let them take." She paused. "Myself. They didn't get that. I kept that." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, "Yes, you did." September came in humid and heavy, and the legal machinery ground forward with the implacable patience of legal machinery everywhere, slowly, thoroughly, and with more paperwork than anyone who had not worked inside it could easily imagine. Margaret Whitmore was formally arrested and appeared before the circuit court 3 times in September alone. Her solicitor, not Henshaw, who had arranged his own cooperation in exchange for reduced liability, but a new man named Whitfield, who had the particular expression of someone who had taken a case for the money and was finding the money inadequate, argued strenuously on her behalf. The arguments were good ones, professionally speaking. They simply ran into the problem of existing in opposition to a genuine will. A father's private letter, a physician's full confession, 3 years of ledger evidence, and the testimony of a living witness who had kept a document for 4 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Eleanor attended every session she was permitted to attend. She sat in the gallery and she watched the proceedings, and she asked Alcott questions afterward in writing that Alcott began to answer with increasing specificity because he had understood within 2 weeks of representing her that she was not asking for reassurance, she was asking to learn. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her one afternoon, after she'd identified a discrepancy in the opposing counsel's timeline argument that he'd missed. "Women aren't lawyers," she said. "Not yet," he said. "Give it time." She looked at him. She almost smiled. "I'll put it on the list." The twist that changed the final shape of the case arrived not from the court, but from Margaret herself. It was a Tuesday in late September. Eleanor was in Alcott's office reviewing the estate account summaries when his clerk came in with a folded letter and a look on his face that meant the letter was unusual. Alcott read it. His expression did not change, which meant it was significant. He handed it to Eleanor. It was from Margaret Whitmore, written in her own hand. Addressed not to Alcott, not to the court, not to anyone legal. Addressed to Eleanor. Eleanor read it. It was not an apology. She had not expected an apology. It was not a plea, not a manipulation, not a legal strategy dressed in personal language. It was, as far as Eleanor could determine, something she had never once received from Margaret Whitmore in her entire life. The truth. 3 pages. Plain language. No performance. Margaret described meeting Edmund Whitmore at 41, already a widow, already afraid of poverty in a way that wealth doesn't fix, because the fear of losing it replaces the fear of never having it. She described the marriage and the stepdaughter who looked exactly like Edmund, who carried Edmund in every feature and every habit and every way she moved through a room, and how that resemblance had been from the beginning the thing Margaret could not manage. Not hatred exactly, more like an accounting problem. Eleanor's existence meant Eleanor's inheritance. Eleanor's inheritance meant a split. A split meant vulnerability. And vulnerability for a woman who had been poor once and was determined never to be poor again was intolerable. She did not say she was sorry. She said she understood now that she had been wrong. Not in the moral sense, or not only in the moral sense, but in the practical one. She had been so afraid of losing everything that she had done things that guaranteed she would lose it. She had understood this in the moment Deputy Crane had walked her out of the Whitmore estate while the summer birds were still singing, and she had not stopped understanding it since. She did not ask Eleanor for anything. The letter ended simply, "I thought you deserved to know why. You don't have to do anything with this." Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. Then she looked at Alcott. "This changes nothing legally." "No," he agreed. "She's not asking for leniency." "No." Eleanor set the letter down. She thought about Margaret's face in the doorway of the East Wing that first day 3 years ago, when she'd said, "You do not exist with the calm of someone ordering linen." She thought about it, and she thought about the letter, and she held both things at once, the way you hold two true things that don't resolve each other. "File it with the court as character evidence if it helps the case," Eleanor said. "Otherwise, it's a private letter and it stays private." Alcott nodded. "She was afraid," Eleanor said more quietly. "That doesn't excuse it, but I understand it." She paused. "I spent 3 years in a locked room understanding things about people who were afraid. Fear makes people into shapes they wouldn't choose." She stood up and picked up the estate account summary she'd been reviewing. "Now, this discrepancy on page 7. Walk me through it again." The final ruling came on a Wednesday in October, when the maple trees along the Boston Common had gone the specific red that Massachusetts does better than anywhere else, and the air had the first real bite of autumn in it. Eleanor sat in the front of the gallery, not the back, because Alcott had arranged observer status for her as the primary plaintiff party, and she intended to use every inch of it. Clara was beside her. Nathaniel sat at the attorney's table in his judicial capacity there to certify the court's findings against his original petition. Judge Harrington read the ruling in the measured, deliberate voice that courtrooms require, and Eleanor listened to every word. The Whitmore estate inheritance transfer of 1814 permanently voided. The estate to be administered according to the terms of Edmund Whitmore's original will of 1811. Eleanor Grace Whitmore to assume her full legal inheritance upon completion of the forensic account review with interim protected status effective immediately. Margaret Constance Whitmore found liable on all 3 counts: fraud, forgery, criminal misappropriation. Sentencing to follow in 60 days with the court, noting cooperation through legal process as a mitigating factor. The estate account's full forensic review complete. Additional funds to be restored to Eleanor's portion, amounting to $11,000 in unauthorized transfers that predated Edmund's death. $11,000. Eleanor did not react visibly when she heard the number. She had promised herself she would not react visibly, whatever it was, because she was going to leave this courtroom with the same composure she'd entered it. But the number landed in her chest like a weight, the specific physical weight of understanding for the first time with full precision what 3 years in a locked room had actually been about. Not just her presence, not just her inconvenience. $11,000 in unauthorized transfers, and then the entirety of a $60,000 estate, and then whatever else would have followed. She had not been hidden out of inconvenience or dislike. She had been hidden because she was worth it. The thought was dark, and it was also in its way clarifying. She picked up her gloves from her lap and held them and breathed and listened to Harrington complete the ruling. Eleanor Grace Whitmore declared legally independent. Full legal personhood restored. All previous documents purporting to deny or eliminate her legal status, null and void of no effect, expunged from the county record. Null and void. Of no effect. Expunged. She breathed in. She breathed out. It was done. Outside the courtroom on the steps in the October air, with the city moving around them, the way cities move indifferently, efficiently full of its own concerns, Eleanor stood and felt the particular quality of an ending. Clara hugged her again tighter this time, and Eleanor held on, and this time she didn't have the unfamiliarity problem she knew now how to be held. She'd been practicing for 2 months. She knew that being held by someone who loved you was not a thing to brace against. Alcott shook her hand and told her she was the most prepared client he'd worked with in 20 years, and that she should strongly consider the law when women were permitted to practice it. She thanked him, and meant it. Judge Farwell, who had made the trip from Whitmore County specifically for the ruling, told her that her father would have been proud in the way that old men say true things without sentiment as a statement of simple fact. She thanked him too, and then they were gone. Alcott to his next case. Farwell to the road home. Clara to find a hack cab back to Tremont Street, and Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps with the October light on her and Nathaniel Reed beside her. He did not say anything immediately. That was one of the things she'd come to understand about him over 2 months of depositions and evidence reviews and courtroom sessions, and evenings when he'd stopped by Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house with documents that could have been sent by messenger. But weren't he? Did not fill silence with noise. He let things be what they were. 47 items, she said. He glanced at her. The list. I've gotten through 31. She looked at the street. 16 to go. What's number 32? She had known he would ask that. She'd known it the way she knew things now, with a clarity that came from paying close attention over time, from learning someone the way you learn a legal document carefully and completely, and with full regard for what the words actually said, rather than what you'd hoped they'd say. I need to go back to the estate, she said. I need to walk through every room. I need to sit at the table and sleep in a room with unlocked doors and stand in the library and pull books off the shelves and put them back. She paused. I need to live in the house like it belongs to me, because it does. And until I've done that, it's still the place where I was kept. I need to make it into the place where I live. He nodded slowly. When? Soon, before it gets cold. She looked at him. I'd like you to come. The silence that followed was a different kind from any silence they'd shared before. It was not the silence of professional distance or procedural courtesy. It was the silence of a thing being offered and received and held carefully on both sides, while both people understood what it meant. That's outside the scope of the case, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm asking. He looked at her for a moment. In the October light with the court behind them, and the case formally closed, and everything that had been locked or hidden, or falsified or denied, now on record as the truth. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and they were just two people on a set of steps. Yes, he said. One word. No qualification. She nodded. She turned back to the street and looked at Boston moving around her, its noise, its indifference, its beautiful, ordinary, unlocked life. She had 47 things on her list, and 16 left to do, and an estate that was hers, and a sister who had chosen correctly when it mattered, and a man who had tipped his hat at a ghost and ridden through the night and stood in a doorway and said, "Let go of her arm," in a voice that expected to be obeyed. She had her name on a court document stamped and witnessed and real. She had herself the self she had kept carefully and stubbornly and without permission through 3 years in a room where they'd tried everything except taking the one thing she refused to give. Eleanor Grace Whitmore stepped down from the courthouse steps and into the October morning, and the city received her the way cities receive the living, without ceremony, without apology, as simply and completely as though she had always been there. Because she had always been there. She had always existed. And now, finally, the world had caught up with that fact.